I'd like to welcome Mark Field, who's a businessman, an author, and a commentator, and also a former MP. And he has written this book, The
Yeah,
End of
the
an
end of an
Era, the
era. Yeah.
decline. Yes, the decline and fall of the Tory Party. Although, maybe the demise of the Tories is a little bit premature, as reform seem to be completely imploding at the moment. So maybe while their stock is low at the moment, they may have another turn. So even if it means it's the least worst option,
Well, listen, it's
which
very interesting. It's often the way, as you know, when people write books, you spend a lot of time preparing, and it's 125,000 words. I gave about a year's worth of time thinking about the structure of the book, and then actually was able to write it much more quickly than I thought I would. But the title only really came at the 11th hour, so you never quite know whether it sort of fits with the mood of the times. But I think we are in unusual times in British politics, and in very unpredictable times. And we've had a duopoly really for the last 100 years of the Conservative and the Labour Party as the two big parties. And I am old enough to remember the early 1980s when the SDP came into being, and they briefly soared and then fell away. And I think everyone has taken for granted the idea, well, it's going to be difficult to have a disruptor party. And maybe Reform won't be that disruptor party. It could be that the Liberal Democrats, and I think one of the things that if you've touched on, that everyone sort of assumes that if the Tories are down, it'll be Reform up or vice versa. The last general election, although the Conservatives did lose seats to Reform, we also lost dozens of seats, over 60, to the Liberal Democrats, and they are making continued headway at local government level, particularly in the home counties, as well as in some of their heartlands of the southwest. So it's a fascinating time in British politics, but dare I say, a difficult time for the country as a whole. And in many ways, it's very difficult to see how we get out of the hole we're in economically, whoever is in government.
Well, yes, that's very true. But we can come back to that in a bit. Before we go into it, would you mind just starting by just giving a little bit of background on yourself, your family, your home life, etc.? Because I think it was very interesting. You mentioned when you were very young, there was an incident in Tesco's, which sort of started your whole thinking about a political career. Do you want to just
Yeah, it
uh,
did. I think listen,
go
we all
into
have
that a bit?
our background. I had a very, I guess, one level quite standard middle class British background. I'm a grammar school boy who went to university, up to Oxford in the mid 1980s, and met some interesting folk there, many of whom became prominent in public life and in journalism. I suppose what was slightly unusual in my background was my mother was German. She was from a part of Germany that
Mm.
is now in Poland. So she was born at the beginning of the war and was one of the roughly 11 million Germans who were ethnically cleansed. It wasn't a phrase that was used at that time, from the east to the west. She ended up, having been a refugee twice by the age of 15, meeting my father in West Germany, where he was serving in the British Army. So politics was always sort of in my mind. I mean, talking about my mother's background as I was growing up. So it was always something that I had an interest in. And I guess it was instilled in me, although my parents were not political themselves, but that politics was too important to be left to someone else. And as you rightly say,
Mm.
there was a particular incident in my sort of mid-teens. Reading was my hometown, and I was in the Butts Centre, which has long since been replaced. It was a very sort of brutalist early 1970s shopping centre that briefly towered above things in the centre of Reading. And I was in the local Tesco's, and there was an elderly man there, and quite well to do, but he was literally crying, looking at the few pennies in his hand. And it was at the time in the sort of period 1976, 77, I guess, when inflation was at 25, 26%. And many people were living at that time, and I assumed he was in that boat, on fixed incomes. So suddenly
Yes.
higher prices were really making a massive impact on their day-to-day life. And I remember just with some shock watching this man, and it was that whole inflationary period, and it has always stuck in my mind. And I think the thing about inflation is that it's so corrosive to trust in any institutions and trust in money, trust in government. And one of the reasons I was very much in favour of what Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt were doing, although it was all in vain as far as the Conservatives' political prospects were concerned, when inflation began to peak up a little bit, in the aftermath of the pandemic, one of the first things they did was make sure they did everything to get that inflation down. And it had an impact, obviously, on day-to-day living standards, but very quickly to get inflation at a low level was important. And that was a big thing that for people who were growing up in the 1970s, it was a major political force. And one of the things that Margaret Thatcher in opposition talked about, to very much positioned herself as the housewife looking after the day-to-day spending and why we needed to get inflation down. And it was something that always very much appealed to me. And I think in the broader economic sense, as I say, the idea of highly rising prices, and of course it impacted to an extent on my my maternal grandparents in Germany with the runaway inflation of the 1920s. And it is a very deeply held idea that inflation and high inflation is a bad thing, not just for the economy, but for trust in politics and in the whole political process.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I grew up in Africa, and obviously hyperinflation was a real problem in places like Zimbabwe. And there was a joke that if you found a wheelbarrow full of money, you'd chuck the money away and steal the wheelbarrow.
Yeah.
So you're absolutely right that it does erode trust, and also there seems to be a total disconnect between the way that the political class run their own household affairs and the way that they run the country. There's a disconnect between, political accountability, and there's not enough skin in the game, as Nassim Taleb would put it. People are making these vast, risky decisions, and they don't seem to have any proper fallout for it personally.
Yeah.
And it's the country and the taxpayer that actually end up suffering for it.
Well, I think one of the big themes of the book, a general theme, it's a memoir, but it's a little bit more. It's about my life and times. And I've just turned 60, and I'm just a baby boomer. I was born in October 1964, and it's reflecting really on that whole sense that my generation, our generation of the people who are baby boomers, have had a good life. We haven't had to go to war. We've grown up at a time of peace, and of course we reflect on what's happening in Ukraine or the Middle East, and reflect that maybe that we have taken that for granted. But other things such as, I'd say I was one of the first of my family to go to university at a time when I came out of university without any debt, and right at the end of that period when you didn't have large debts, and we relied on grants rather than loans as university students. I got on the housing ladder in the late 1980s at a time, fun enough, when it didn't seem all rosy. I was able to buy a flat as soon as I left university in 1988, and it wasn't all rosy for all of us at that point. Of course, the property market had jolted up in the previous few years, and then there was high interest rates and negative equity.
So
and all
servicing
that,
the debt was expensive, wasn't it?
It was expensive for the early years of my adult life, and being on the housing ladder. I was lucky to be in employment, and it didn't particularly impact on me. But I touch on that in my book. I sort of go through some of the the journey I went on. But I look at it now, and it's funny enough, I've got a 17-year-old son and a 14-year-old daughter, and my son is already fairly savvy about these things. He says, Daddy, how am I ever going to get onto the housing ladder? There's a worry about that. And, the multiples of salary, which, of course, when interest rates were very low, as they were very artificially between 2009 and 2022, everyone thought, well, we can manage that. But suddenly, with interest rates going up, actually to not at especially high levels, at 4.25% today, it's not that high by historic standards, but it seems to be and make life very difficult for youngsters, particularly trying to get multiples of their income to get onto the housing ladder. And so, the life that I think many people of my generation had is one that is very difficult to replicate for the next generation. And I think, outside of wartime, that is almost unique.
Yes, that's true. And it's made even worse now with the hike in NI insurance, because now it's much more difficult for firms to hire young people, and an awful lot of them are NEETs, not in education or employment. And this is just a tragedy for opportunity. It just seems to go from bad to worse all the time, and it would be really nice to have a little bit of good news on the horizon.
Well, I think, the other thing is, again, I was a part of a generation not that long ago, but, I graduated, well, it is almost 40 years ago now. And I think I was one of sort of 14%, roughly 1 in 7 of my cohort went to university. Now it's around about 40%. So you've got this large number of graduates, but the economy is not developed in such a way that it is sucking up as
And
many
in fact,
graduates
a lot of those
as required.
graduates should be doing technical training, or they should be doing apprenticeships, and they should be skilling up for the jobs that we are desperately short of. And actually, you describe it very well in your book that a lot of the degrees are missold,
Yeah.
and the university sector is relying so much on foreign students, and that is a Ponzi scheme that has to come to an end at some point.
Well, I think, as you say, that whole issue, as you put it, Ponzi scheme, applies to so many aspects of
It
British life. And
does.
so the university sector has become overly reliant on foreign students, as you say. We're now having a hostile relationship with China. So how many more Chinese students will come? We're clamping down on the numbers of family people coming in. And
Let's
I
just
understand that, but equally, it makes a question mark about the number of Indian students coming. All the issues around, the financial wherewithal of countries such as Nigeria mean that again there are fewer students. And the other thing, as I say in the book, is that one thing that's very evident to me is that the big USP that many British universities have is the English language, and now that is almost universal. It's one of the things
Yes, it
that has
is.
been
Yes.
changed so rapidly in my adult life that whereas, as I say, 30 years ago, uh, having English language was a rarity. Now, if you want to be in the ruling class or the professional classes globally, you've got to have English. It
Absolutely.
struck me particularly when I was
You do make an interesting point in the book that the Chinese elite tend to vote with their feet, though, and they send money offshore, and they also still send their kids to
Well,
UK.
and it is fascinating, and at one level, again, we've seen it with DeepSeek, the big AI outfit out of China that has gone from nowhere apparently to being a global leader. You see it actually with some of the Chinese universities, and I think that the next generation of Chinese aren't necessarily going to be going, or in such large numbers, going to the US or to the UK for university education. There are some very, very good homegrown universities. But it is interesting that the Chinese elite have over recent years, particularly with the one-child policy, they've tended to invest all their into their son or daughter to go to a US university, to go and join a leading US bank or UK finance house or law firm. Partly, I guess, in their hearts, there's a recognition that there is a level of uncertainty that applies, and if you see the rise of President Xi, I mean, he's got an interesting life of his own. I believe there's a biography actually of his father who's come out, and he is one of what's called the princelings. His father was a leading communist member, and then with the Maoist revolution, suddenly was sort of persona non grata, and it made for a difficult life actually for Xi in his early adulthood as well. But there's always that sense of uncertainty, and perhaps here in the UK and in much of Europe, there is still an establishment sense that if you have ticked the boxes and with your educational background and your professional background, life is going to be fairly comfortable for you, or at least fairly predictable. I mean, maybe that can't be
Yes.
taken for granted either. I mean, I have to say, I left university, I became a lawyer, and I look upon how difficult it is now to get into the top professions in a way that, as I say, 40 years ago, as a graduate from somewhere like Oxford, you sailed into those sorts of jobs. It may not necessarily be a career you wanted to have for life. Certainly, I didn't. But nonetheless, that first step was relatively straightforward. But even getting that far now, I think, is much more difficult for the younger generation. And I that will have an impact, I think, on both. The risk is that it's quite a brain drain from this country, but also I think for many young people who feel that the social contract just isn't working out for them in a way that it was for our
Yeah.
generation.
But then on the other hand, there are so many different ways of obtaining skills and education. You don't need to go to university. You can do online courses, and there's so many different ways of breaking into professions. And I think there is an opportunity for young people if they step off the sort of accepted path.
It's fascinating with teenage children. This is very much in the forefront of one's mind, and at one level, of course. not least because of my own experience. I think my wife and I both feel, oh yes, we'd like our children to go to university, but if they turned round and said, actually, here's a plan B, I'm not sure that it's necessarily would be the wrong option for either of them. But time will tell. But you're right. I think that youngsters today, I think, have far more savvy. They're far more able to think beyond doing a standard related degree, and particularly those who are entrepreneurial. It may
Yes.
well be that actually they get some pretty bad habits actually in 3 or 4 years at university, rather than necessarily following a path that might be not just more lucrative, but actually might lead to much more exciting possibilities for their longer term.
Well, exactly, especially as AI has shown us that the world can just change on a dime. And actually, there's so many jobs just around the future that we can't even imagine at the moment. I just think it's so important to have different skills and to link them all together. In fact, I've just read Charlie Munger's book,
Yeah.
Poor Charlie's Almanac, which I really, really recommend. And in fact, it should be essential reading for anyone in government because he talks about the importance of having a lattice work of knowledge. You shouldn't just learn one subject, you should learn how all the subjects link together. And the other thing he does is he advises everyone to always invert. So if you're thinking about a policy, instead of thinking about how marvelous it is and how wonderful, you should think immediately what could possibly go wrong, you
There's
know.
always quite a lot, I guess. But no,
Yes.
well, funny enough,
I
one of the
mean,
things I always say to my children is actually some of those soft skills will matter more because they're there for life. And as you say, education has got to be an ongoing process. Keep on reading, keep on learning, and recognize that you may have to go through a set of careers. Certainly, I mean, the notion of a job for life has gone. But actually, as you say, it's that broader based skill base that has to come into play. And you see, and even in the professions, so much has become and is becoming commoditized. And you touched on the impact of AI, and it's unpredictable as to how AI plays out. Is it a force for good, a force for concern? But whichever way you look at it, it means you can't take for granted that the skill base that you develop today is going to necessarily be something that will be
at
at the
all.
forefront of things in a decade's time, let alone in 30 years' time.
Yeah, I just think the best thing we can do is embrace AI and learn how to use it to our advantage. But there are some really worrying things, like, for example, Meta's, appropriation of books and without permission to teach the large language learning models. It's really worrying, the sort of loss of copyright and privacy as well. I think people, the implications of it just aren't, it's going to take ages for that to play out.
Yeah.
So,
The idea that you can legislate for this, either you can do, or that there is a single model. And I think again, this is one of the issues that we face in the geopolitical world.
uh,
Is perhaps again we in the West have taken for granted that our model is the right model and everyone else will just have to follow it. Certainly one of the themes of my book is that um, the sense of exceptionalism we have in the UK is partly because of the institutional infrastructure that has been put into place since 1945. But the world has changed a lot in the last 80 years, and you look at the rise of China, the rise of India.
mhm.
You look at what's happening even today with much greater pace, really, in the Middle East. And we have a sense of these are our values, the rules-based international system. Even if you've touched on the concerns about AI, about copyright. Copyright works well for the Western values, actually works well, dare I say it, for a relatively diminished demography. But is that necessarily something that works well for much emerging nations? Maybe not. And perhaps we shouldn't be too surprised that they want us to set up a commercial model that doesn't see copyright at its very, very heart. And, so I'm not being glib about it. And I do recognize that if you're a musician or you're in the creative industries, it's a hell of a shock to think that all of your creative genius is going to be essentially diminished to having no value at all. But equally, I think we have to recognize in the West that a system that we have put into place that benefits us isn't one necessarily that is going to be rolled out globally in the
No, not
decades
at
to
all.
come.
And in fact, you touch on it very well in your book that the imposition of Western values, actually like LGBT or women's rights or anything like that, can actually be seen as neocolonialism, and this is very uncomfortable, and it forces people to reassess. And you put it very well in your book that actually the protection of minorities in places like Afghanistan, for example, are actually best served by dynastic dictators. And that is horrible for a Western person to contemplate, but it is true. Again, touching on my own African background, the way that government works over there is very different to, and, the protection of minorities is super important. Otherwise, you get disasters like Rwanda. And I know Rwanda's changed an awful lot in the last 20 odd years, but, it's a really thorny issue, and interventionism isn't always the answer.
No,
So,
this came to my mind at a very early stage, well before the Arab Spring, but in a trip I made 22 years ago to Syria, and I met the young President Assad. Bashar Assad had taken over from his father only 2 or 3 years before then. He had great plans about. I mean, he's a very softly spoken man, very much at odds with the murderous dictator that he
was it?
ended up
He's an
becoming.
ophthalmologist, isn't he? He was
Yeah.
trained to be an eye
No,
doctor.
exactly. Well, and of course, he thought he was going to have a medical career, and it was his older brother who was killed in a car crash, and suddenly he was thrown into the main seat, and then took over from his father. And no, he had great plans about actually technology and other things, but ultimately the broad security infrastructure of his father's regime was kept very much in place. But it was a conversation I had when we went down, literally 45 minutes from Damascus to an ancient Christian community, which had obviously been Christian since the time of Paul in Damascus in the century after Christ's death. And it was talking to a pastor there who he made that case to say, listen, we all talk about the importance of democracy, but in many countries, unfortunately, democracy becomes the tyranny of the majority, the tyranny of the
It does, yeah.
51%, making the other life miserable for the rest. And the Christian minority felt its interests not just in Syria, but in countries like Iraq and Egypt, was actually better protected by a dynastic dictatorship. And unfortunately, one only needs to look at the diminution in numbers over the last 20 years of not just Christian, but other minorities in those countries. And it suggests that this headlong rush towards the Arab Spring and democracy flourishing hasn't actually worked well for many ordinary people in many of those countries.
No, it really hasn't. And in fact, well, the persecution of Christians is a whole new issue. And I've been wondering why the Church of England will never stand up for it. They never make any sort of pronouncement on it, and it drives me insane. But anyway, we're really getting off topic. So going back to your university days, you were actually at uni at Oxford with a lot of the really big beasts of politics, and like Boris Johnson, obviously Keir Starmer as well.
Yeah.
It's really interesting that you out Nick Robinson as an early Tory in your book. I'm sure he's never going to forgive you for that.
I don't think I'd put it out at him. No, it was funny. It was a very political generation, and I'm sure, like every generation of student politicians, probably most of the fellow students on there, who are these bloody people? What do they know what's going on? And suddenly, we were a very political generation, and so say Boris was the year above me. I mean, people like Michael Gove and Jeremy Hunt the year below. Actually, David Cameron was the year below, but wasn't really involved in student politics the way that the rest of us were. David Miliband I knew very well. He was my year when we were both junior common room presidents of our respective colleges. But as you rightly say, the other person was Keir Starmer, who was at my college, and he was a postgraduate in law, doing the Bachelor of Civil Law when I was an undergraduate. So I did get to know him a little bit, and we did a little bit when I was JCR president, came across some politics. And of course, we ended up 30 years on being MPs in neighbouring constituencies. And the one thing I do say in the book, and I didn't know Keir that well, I did come across him during his 1 year, because it was a 1 year, pretty hard as nails postgraduate degree that he was doing. But his style was, even then, a suspicion he was kind of more left wing than meets the eye. But his style, as much as it is now, he was very He was always well dressed, for example. And a lot of students, even at that time, wouldn't necessarily have been, particularly those who were politically active. And there was never any great tub thumping style, and he was very measured in
Well,
his
he's more
approach.
studious and thoughtful, isn't he? He's a sort of a
He is, and
quiet.
yeah, and and as I say in the book, I mean, he would be wrong to underestimate him. I mean, it has
Well, I mean,
surprised
he's
me.
the prime minister, so.
Yeah,
But on the other hand, he's really floundering at the moment.
yeah, I
He's
mean, and
not
that has
having a
surprised
good
me.
war, is he?
Yeah, sorry.
He's well. I'm just. What advice would you give Keir Starmer right now?
I don't think he would need my advice particularly. I think. I mean, listen, things are very, very difficult on the economy. There's no doubt about that, and I think it's difficult to see how things get turned around all that quickly. And I think the problem, partly that Labour faced, was having suddenly gone from some zero to hero. From a position when it looked as though, I mean, only 4 years ago, everyone was talking about the idea of the 2020s being the Boris Johnson decade. In the aftermath of the pandemic, when essentially politics went into sort of almost deep freeze, and there was
Mm.
this, for a year and a half or so, the Tory vote share remained very high. There was a sense that obviously huge amounts of money were pumped into keeping the economy going, and then suddenly the impact of that economically came into play. Then all the shenanigans around Partygate, and the brief interlude with Elizabeth Truss, and then obviously Rishi Sunak trying to pick up the pieces. So Labour came into office, and I think there was a perception that there would just be the country was just going to be grateful to see the back of those Tories. And the reality was, very quickly, there were expectations. Well, what are you going to achieve? And I think part of the difficulty was when he talked about change, really, all he's offered to date has been continuity, really. I mean,
But it hasn't been. In fact, he's made things worse.
well, yeah, I mean, but there hasn't been the
Okay, so
fundamental change. As you
yes,
say, you made things worse by, well, we'll pay off those unions here, we'll find money for this, that, and the other.
and really ratcheting up potential inflation in doing so by ratcheting up the public debt, which is worrying, is eye-wateringly huge enough as it is. And now he's increased the union power. He's by increasing NI, he's made it really difficult to hire people. He's made it so. Just as a personal example, I was going to hire my intern to Inkspot Publishing, and I couldn't afford to do it. There was just no way I couldn't do it. So now I
I
have
mean,
to.
that's so
So I
disappointing for you. It's disappointing for you, building a trust with a
absolutely,
young
but I
intern
mean,
who
it does
wants to
have a.
get on a ladder.
The story has a happy ending. I helped her find another job. She's now working for an academic publisher and she's doing very well. But she was a graduate and she was really talented. And she just wanted to earn enough money to leave home, which is fair enough. And the NI hike made that really impossible for me to hire her, whereas I was on the verge of doing so beforehand. So, and it just would have been irresponsible to take her on. I'm running my business as I wish the
The
political
country could be
class would
run.
run the
Yeah,
country. You make tough decisions.
it,
She's
it,
got
it
herself
could. Yeah, well,
a lovely job at an, but it is really difficult to imagine how. I mean, they haven't done anything positive, and I cannot understand for the life of me why you get in on a huge majority. Everyone's delighted to see the back of the Tories, and the first thing you do is take away the winter fuel allowance for old people. Why would you do that? It's just the most deranged policy imaginable.
Well, I mean,
And now,
in the scheme of things, it doesn't make a lot of difference money-wise. I think that the trouble really was, again, and there was a sort of sense, I think, in which Starmer and Reeves wanted to almost to replicate what Blair and Brown had done in the run-up to 1997. And of course, the economic situation was entirely different. But they wanted to
very
go into it
different,
and
yeah.
say, we don't want to scare the horses. So we're not going to raise income tax. We're not going to raise VAT. We're not going to raise national insurance for employees, at least. And of course, the reality was, once you do that, you're putting a massive straitjacket on in terms of what you can do. And so and I remember did think this, you may recall in 97, Brown then changed pension rules. There was a sort of 5
I
billion.
remember very well.
Much of that was done partly because he needed to find a pocket of money to do something with, but also everyone thought, oh well, pension, that'll take years before that actually has an impact. And one of the things that's also happened at the moment, and people say, oh, well, the rich should pay more tax. They're actually paying higher levels of tax and income tax, the richest 1%, than has ever been the case in the past. But the changes on the non-dom, which actually began a little bit even in the Conservative time, but in doing that, there are significant numbers of people who have just said, who are mobile, who are saying, right, in that case, the uncertainty about tax, we're going to go, and partly because the rules were going to change to such an extent that almost if you stay in this country, you have a situation similar to American citizens. You have to pay global tax on all of your income and on your inheritance. And for some, they've just taken the view, we will move on. And of course, that has only accelerated the level of deficit that we've now got into the economy. The trouble really is we've been living beyond our means for far too long, and very low
Yes.
interest rates. And I'm afraid that was, I think, one of the biggest bugbears about the Conservative time, particularly, I'm afraid, in the Cameron-Osborne era, when for many, many years we just kept essentially a zero interest rate regime going, or interest rates did not go above 1% between March of 2009 and the middle of 2022. And because for that period of time it went on for sort
But
of
in theory, that decision should have been the Bank of England, shouldn't it?
well,
That
we
was
had in Mr.
Brown
Mark
had
Carney
given the Bank
a
of
Bank of
England.
England governor who was, as we know, much more political than the average, and that I'm sure was one of the reasons he was taken on by Osborne. I did say so at the time and got quite a bit of flack. I remember in the financial pages, but because I was the city's MP at the time, so my voice counted for a little bit anyway.
Yes.
But that was my concern, that interest rates, we've distorted so much risk, and of course we've gone from a situation before the financial crisis in '08 of having around about 700 million of 700 billion, I should say, of debt, to about 3 trillion. And
Oh, it's terrifying.
we're seeing it in the amount of interest we're paying on our debt is now much bigger than the defence budget. That's not a healthy state of
Isn't it
affairs to be in.
273 million a day? Something like that?
Well,
That we're
yes, I think that's right. It's over 100 trillion, 100 billion a year that we're paying just in
yeah.
debt interest. So we're living beyond our means, and it's an awful thing. I'm
The
now.
thing is that just going back to your former comment about what Gordon Brown did,
Yeah,
what he specifically did in '97 was abolish the dividend tax credit for pension funds. Britain had such a brilliant defined benefit pension scheme that so many companies had really generous pension funds for their employees. And after that action, they, on pretty much en masse, and it happened slowly over time, all moved from defined benefit to defined contribution, which meant that the risk shifted from the employer to the individual, which is so the private sector pensions were effectively decimated as a result, whereas government sector pensions remain defined benefit. And that is another Ponzi scheme because it is constantly paid for by taxpayers.
yeah.
And there's only one line about it in your book. I'm guessing that this is such an intractable problem. It's one of the ones that you mention, that so many government department budgets have to go on pension funds, and this is not fully disclosed to the public, and the public does not understand it.
No, I'm sorry I didn't mention in any great detail, and partly
No.
I didn't want
Maybe
this to be
you
too
thought
dry a
quite
book
rightly
about
it's just
pensions,
too.
and that's the problem actually, is that because it's seen as a dry and esoteric thing. I mean, listen, of course, I'm also, I mean, this. Full disclosure, of course, I transferred the pot I'd built up when I was a businessman to buy years in the parliamentary scheme. So,
And why wouldn't you?
yeah,
Why
I'm
wouldn't you?
afraid
So
I mean,
you'd
it
be
was
foolish
probably the
not
best
to.
economic decision. Although, to be honest, because I qualified for that at the age of 65. In fairness, throughout my time as an MP, I paid 13% contribution a year. It's a fairly substantial contribution to get the maximum parliamentary pension scheme. But I have taken the view that in the back of my mind, that I'm going to have to take a haircut on that. And listen, in all honesty, I suspect I probably will not have to take a haircut. I will get to that pension age, and it is only 4.5 years away now, before fundamental change has to happen. But at some point,
Yeah,
as you say, the disconnect between public and private sector pensions is going to cause literally riots in the streets. And at
it
some
is.
point,
Yes, absolutely right.
probably government
Just
will have to say, right, this is what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to I'd say have a haircut of
but
20,
isn't it
25%
the
on public
case?
pensions.
Isn't it the case? And forgive me, haven't researched this point in detail. It's just from memory. Isn't it the case that the coalition tried to do something about this? And they tried to enroll new government employees in defined contribution schemes, which seems the fairest way of doing it. You put a cap on who, okay, you can't change the arrangement you have with people now. So those who qualify get it. But in future, you can have a cutoff point where people have defined contribution. And in fact, Holland has done this very well. They've pretty much shifted all government employees to well, they have a very different system for a start, but they have not only shifted most people to defined contribution, but also they have pension dashboards. So whatever age you are, you can actually log in and see what your entitlements are, whether you need to top your fund up, at what age you should retire, and the effect on your pension if you make on the decisions that you make. And those people who were enrolled after the coalition made this decision, as a class action, took the government to court and won. So why is the judiciary never on the side of the taxpayer?
Well, as you say, nothing should be set in stone. I mean, the other thing, of course, you could say is, well, if people realised just how much in equivalent of salary, I mean, you could be saying to someone, well, actually, okay, in order to get that reduced pension benefit, you need to be raising salaries or by 30% or reducing the salaries of those who are getting a defined benefit scheme benefit by an equivalent amount, and that essentially was part of the problem. So I guess it was probably equalities legislation that they were able to rely upon to say, that we're
That's
doing
the
the same
thing,
job
yeah.
for the same money, or we should be. And if you unilaterally change our terms in this way, then that's what undermines it. But as you say, what it means is that there's still a sense that the public sector is cosseted. And of course, most people in the private sector don't quite understand how that's going to play out. And dare I say it, when everyone gets to their 60s, and if you've been working in a private sector and you're then holidaying with a lot of your friends who are in the civil service or in working in NHS trusts or whatever, and suddenly see the difference, then all sorts of irritation will emerge.
Yeah, make them buy the sangria. That's really the only thing you can do, isn't it?
If they can
So,
afford
yeah.
any alcohol at all by that stage, yes. Uh, I mean, this is part of the trouble here. We are in a very British way. We're laughing it off and making a joke out of all of it. But it's serious. It's serious for the next
Yes.
generation. And as I say, I look at my motivated, educated young teenage children, and I wonder maybe they will conclude that they don't want to be paying into this Ponzi scheme anymore, and vote with their feet and leave this country, and then that's the risk
Absolutely.
that
Yes.
brain drain,
Although,
which I mean,
not
I
that
grew up in the
it's,
70s and early 80s, and everyone was talking about that, and then that seemed to disappear for some decades. But I think that whole conversation has become a lot more active in recent times.
well, actually, one of the things you said in your book, which I thought was really interesting, is that it's politics' dirty little secret that there are some problems that are so intractable that actually they don't get solved and the can gets kicked down the road. And we know this. So social care in this country, obviously pensions, but pensions and social care are very linked, as are house prices and house building, and and productivity. These are such huge problems that successive governments of both parties, and including the coalition, so that does drag the Lib Dems in as well, have failed to deal with these issues. So we'll get to Britain's global standing and Brexit and all that sort of stuff in a bit, but a lot of us just want our governments to focus on what's broken at home.
Yeah.
before we worry about what goes on abroad. And obviously you can't ignore foreign policy because you've got Putin running around, and you've got, you know, it was at Harold Macmillan, events, dear boy,
Yeah.
events, you know, that's
His famous phrase, yes, yeah. Well, as I say, you know, you're very kind to have obviously read the book, but it is a dirty little secret, and people often complain that MPs have become super councillors, spending a lot of time on local business. But actually, as you say, so many of the bigger economic problems nationally, as well as the international problems, seem so intractable. The view is, well, you know, we can get on, do our stuff at a local level, be a hard-working, consistent and local MP, work on the day-to-day problems of our constituents.
And I can really understand why that is so attractive,
Yeah, no, I
because
can too.
you
No, no.
actually get results.
Yeah.
And but it also, I suppose, if you're power hungry and you feel the hand of history, and you know, and you have some sort of sense of personal destiny, you're going to ignore your constituents and focus on how to become PM. Whereas, you know, if you're unburdened by those things, which you make it very clear that you were, constituency work is actually quite attractive. And I can really see how making a difference to someone where you see the whites of their eyes is really amazing. But I just wondered, and you touch on it, that you actually had quite a lot of cross-party cooperation with people like Frank Dobson and Karen Buck. Don't you think that some problems are just too big for one party to solve, and we have to be grown up about it? And instead of worrying about PMQs and voter numbers, you know, the parties have to work together to fix these problems. And is it ever likely to happen?
You're absolutely right, and you know, I used to loathe the whole PMQ's business, and then quite a lot of MPs, I think, didn't
Well, it's totally
didn't enjoy.
performative. I don't
It
think.
is, and part of politics, particularly the scene, is performative. We're living in that world with TV and communication, so one can't deny that there's an aspect of it that can't go away. The difficulty is, I mean, to be candid with you, is that, I mean, you know, if, for example, you know, we try to have a policy on social care or something, and if you bring it up as Theresa May did in 2017 in the midst of an election campaign, it wasn't surprising that you were going to see more heat than light, and that there wasn't going to be a chance of bringing the parties together. But also, I mean, there are certain things. I mean, you know, as a conservatives have tended to take a view. Well, you know, we can be trusted with the defence of the realm, and therefore there's always an accusation that somehow Labour are not being patriotic. And I think Starmer has been well aware of that and has pushed, you know, particularly after the Corbyn interlude. On the other hand, you know, there is a sense of the NHS is only safe in Labour's hands, and in every general election, it's 24 hours to save the NHS is the Labour line against the Conservatives. But as you say, these are all areas. I mean, defence now in particular, but you know, but future funding of the health service, of social care, where you do need not just to have a level of compromise and agreement. I mean, although, you know, a little bit of disagreement is also a healthy thing in the political process. You don't want too much of the sense of the political class make their decision and the rest of the people will have to put up with it. But on the one hand, you know, you do need to try to impress that upon people at large. But it is also fairly difficult to do that, other than saying this is going to be over a long period of time. Because actually, the worst of all things is to have a stop-start situation where you start going down one route. But, you know, one of the things that I say in the book is that, you know, again, we had a coalition government, and we always rather, with the hindsight, particularly because of, you know, Brexit that happened in the aftermath of that coalition, we lionised those 5 years of Conservative and Liberal and Cameron and Clegg. But if you think about it, you know, ultimately going into a coalition actually, ironically, made us further away from getting to the compromise. You know, we knew what the challenges were in 2010. You know, the challenges were, how do you get a
Yeah.
social care? How do we make sure that we keep the lights on and have an energy policy that works, and not to be overly reliant upon Russian gas, etc., etc. How do we make sure that we focus our energies on getting an education system that works? How do we move away from the intergenerational conflict there? And in many ways, all that happened in 2010, these are just seen as two difficult problems. Oh, we'll get an independent commission. Let's kick the can a little bit further
Oh,
down the road. And so what were challenges in 2010 by 2025 are fully flown crises.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Actually, now you've talked about the coalition and David Cameron, that's probably a good time to talk about one of the other overriding themes in the book is Brexit. And you were a very ardent Remainer. And funny enough, Jeremy Hunt has described himself as a born again Brexiteer. um, under what circumstances would you be a born again Brexiteer?
Yeah, I mean, listen, Jeremy is still a player. I'm now just a commentator. So, and he's a very old friend, as you'll gather. He's godfather to my daughter, and when we knew each other from our university days well. So
Yes.
we've been friends for 40 years. And so he's still, and he recognises where the centre of gravity is in the Conservative Party. I would say probably he.
Not just the party, I think the voters too. I
Well,
think
I
there's
think the voters now are much, much more sceptical about the benefits of Brexit, or at least the way in which
well,
Brexit
they
was
have
carried out.
because a lot of them feel that what they voted for has actually been betrayed. You know, it's been given away, betrayed, poorly negotiated. The EU totally outmaneuvered us in the negotiation package, and a lot of these things they were just not necessarily foreseeable. For example, I think Cameron wasted a real opportunity when he went to the EU and asked for concessions and they refused it. He probably should have remained neutral. He and George Osborne should have probably said, okay, we're going to offer you the referendum. And even you in your book, as an ardent Remainer, said that the referendum had to happen at some point or another. And so if they'd said, we'll give free and fair information to both sides, and then the day after the referendum, David Cameron, will still be PM and George Osborne will still be Chancellor, it wouldn't have had to be so divisive because David Cameron actually, by fleeing the scene the day after, it was just seen as such a huge abnegation of responsibility. And also there was seen that there was no plan. There was no plan for the
Well,
event that Leave would
this
win.
now I do go into some detail in the book, because obviously I lived
Yes.
through that, and in many ways it reflected what was the beginning of the end of my time in Parliament, but also I'm afraid the beginning of the end of the credibility of the Conservative Party as well. Although,
Yes.
ironically, we remained in government for a further 8 years after the referendum, through 5 prime ministers and all the shenanigans that went on, which normally would have happened
But
in
actually,
opposition.
largely because Labour was so inept during
Well,
that
yeah,
time. And
I think that's right. But part of the difficulty, I mean, I felt that we did need to have a referendum. And the promise had been made, from Blair's time about, the Lisbon Agreement at various times we were going to have a referendum. Even the Liberal Democrats had talked, one forgets, in the noughties about the idea we now need to have a referendum on this matter. We'd talked about having a referendum over the single currency. So this was going to come to a head. It needed to go back to the people as it had done in 1975. My preference was always actually just for, we need to have an in-out referendum promise. The thing that Cameron, and why it was so difficult for him, and I have some sympathy for Cameron's situation in the aftermath. I mean, he'd lost the vote.
no, you are very fair about it. I think you're
Well, he put
very fair
he
to.
put a package together, which wasn't all bad. I mean, again, I was in a very multicultural constituency. Over half, even when I was elected in 2001, over half of my constituents, like me, for example, were born outside the UK. So the issues around immigration, I didn't realise just how profound they were beyond the M25, within bits of London, but certainly outside of London, they were much bigger. And in fairness, Cameron, I think, had a very good package that protected our interests as a nation that was not going to join the single currency. And actually, I mean, of course, then none of that came into play, but I think that would have, that had we remained in the EU, that would have been a very useful package. But given that he'd put this package forward, he'd negotiated from the front. It was very difficult. It
Mm.
was impossible for him to stay. In a way, it was even more serious than a confidence vote would have been in Parliament. So the notion that he could have stayed, I think, was never there. The trouble really with going back to your Jeremy Hunt comment about, that's, listen, the Brexit, even I could probably have lived with, was, having been a sort of a meritocratic, small state, free market, Thatcherite type Tory. The idea of Singapore on Thames, but it was never viable in this country. I mean, we've got 5 million um, people who are, of working age who are on out of work benefits. We've got, 8 million
Yes, but that
functionally
that
illiterate
could be
adults.
fixed if we had better policies,
Yeah,
like, for
yeah,
example, a
but the idea
reduction
that
in
we could be
NI.
like Singapore, and really grasp
Yeah.
the opportunity. I mean, Singapore is a small island state, a quite repressive
But
state in
also,
many ways. It's
it
not
would be
really.
so nice to live in a country where it was much easy. It would be much easier to start a business.
Yes.
And it's become incredibly difficult to start a business. And actually, small and mid-sized enterprises are what drives this economy. And making it easy for people like me who run a small business is how we should move forward. It should be bottom-up reform, not none of this, like,
Yeah, yeah,
um,
but also the way that the Brexit referendum was sold. I mean, you remember those famous buses talking about 350 million more for the NHS, or potentially more for the NHS every week. And of course, part of that, of course, was
Well, actually,
well,
how
they've
much
had
has
it.
the NHS received? I haven't delved into, but I bet you an
It's more than that.
equivalent figure.
Yeah. Well,
I bet you it is.
I think with the COVID and everything else, I'm sure it has been. But we talked about that. Um, we talked about taking control of immigration. Well, of course, people who voted
Oh,
for Brexit. People who voted for it said they wanted lower numbers, not and because the argument we've taken control and that we've got our own policy, and of course Boris Johnson and his crew totally lost control of immigration, which is one of the
absolutely,
reasons I'm
yes.
afraid that the Tories aren't going to be forgiven for the tale of woe of what happened with Brexit. Um, but so part of me is I don't want to talk down this country. It's my country. I love it. I'm very glad grew up here. But equally, I think we have to recognise our limitations as well. And as I say, I'm no
Oh,
longer in
I
frontline politics.
completely recognize our limitations, and I don't have any sort of faux nostalgia for empire or any of that rubbish. I just want a political class who will focus on our issues here at home, and and who will really focus on them because they are, as you say, getting, and certainly the pensions issue is so serious, and yet I never see anyone talking about it. I don't see any coverage on it in the papers. It's almost like a ticking time bomb that is totally ignored. And as you say, it could lead to riots in the streets one of these days when people understand the disparity and the total unfairness between the public and the private sector. It is, but just going back to Brexit, it's really interesting. And I think you're very fair to everyone in your book, actually. I think your analysis on most of your, the political leaders, including Labour, is very fair. But you don't criticize at any point the EU for its total intransigence and the ratchet screw, and the fact that power always seemed to flow one way, and it is seen as not only undemocratic but actually anti-democratic when it consistently overturns popular feeling and sentiment, which has led to a huge rise in populist governments in the EU. And now they're letting in Bulgaria. Have they forgotten Greece? Do you see what I mean? It's like Brexit was the first opportunity the British got to actually put the brakes on, and they took it, and it was a very small, but it was decisive. And actually, again, to give you credit, you dismissed the call for the people's vote, which really was anti-democratic, because actually we'd been given a chance. And how many more times do you need to spin a vote before you accept it?
Yeah, no, no,
So
it was, and that was part of the problem you touched on earlier on with why Labour made a mess of things was that actually Corbyn and Starmer, of course, who was the shadow Brexit secretary, their room for manoeuvre was also quite limited pretty quickly. I mean, what they might have done is try and massively divide the Tory Party, go along with Theresa May's deal, and the Tory Party would have been hopelessly split. But by that stage, there was this big momentum for a second referendum. So there was a view, well, that's
yeah.
another prospect. And the trouble,
I can't remember the exact details, but wasn't I think Jeremy Corbyn was for Leave and Keir Starmer was for Remain.
I think
If
Corbyn's
you'd
heart
really,
was in Leave. I mean, he formally said Remain, but part of the difficulty was he was the leader of the Labour Party, and it was
yes,
evident he was very half-hearted about the whole thing. And so, whereas most Labour activists were in favour of Remain. I mean, it's some. Yeah, the whole. I mean, one level. Yes, it's not an ideal situation, and of course, one has to remember. And again, we joined the EEC 17 years after, 16 years after it started in 1973. We were always half-hearted. We only really joined partly because of, our economy. It was a defensive mechanism. Our economy was, doing
A
so badly in
basket
the early
case.
70s, particularly against Germany and France and Italy. We thought, I remember being half German and thinking, 30 years ago we'd won a world war against this country, and
Actually, how much did that's a really good point. How much did being half German influence your thinking?
He did. I mean, listen, Gisela Stewart on the Labour side was fully German, and she was a big leaver.
She
But
was, yeah,
I think
that's
for
true.
there's an emotional side of I
Yes.
feel. I mean, I'm say European, but I'm proud of being half German.
Mm.
I also felt. I mean, as far as Brexit was going, we had a fantastic bespoke deal. That's a tragedy. We weren't in the
Yeah, but
single currency. We had a
w-
big rebate. We weren't in Schengen. We had some of the social legislation that we weren't going to be subject to. And in a sense, and I think this was part of the problem that the Europeans Union, the Commission in particular, felt we've gone bent over backwards for the British over many, many years. They are half-hearted, um, and yes, listen, it isn't democracy as we would understand it. But of course, one has to remember, you know, and again, without sounding as though Britain rules the waves of an empire, but we won the Second World War in 1945. We won a war. Most of the rest of Europe had either been under Nazism or had been
mm,
overtaken for a period of time, and it had therefore had dictatorships and a lot of ongoing political upheaval into the 50s. And of course, much of Eastern Europe, and the countries that joined the EU in 2004, they had spent, decades under communist rule, and so
yes.
they came to it with a totally different sense of where democracy and where accountability lay. Now, we understood that, and maybe that was a justification. And the sovereignty justification. There were people who I knew who surprised me as being leavers, but a lot of it was driven by sovereignty. In a sense, we've got to make our own laws, we've got to make our own rules, and which in principle, I can understand. But the trouble is, we'd spent 45 years in that institution, and to be fair, we were pretty good at negotiating our position. We got our rebate. We set up the
Yeah, what a shame we were not so good at negotiating afterwards. We sort of
well,
forgot all those
and that
little
is
skills.
true. And again, people often go and say, "Well, blame the EU," and I think, well, no, we decided we didn't want to be members of the club, and the European Commission's view was right. We've got to make sure this isn't a precedent, that we don't want others to
Oh,
go down this route. So we have to be punish the Brits a bit. Yeah,
ferociously good at protecting their own interests,
yeah.
and but they ignore the interests of the people that they purport to serve, and I think long term that is going to have profound implications for the EU. For example, Bulgaria, that's going to join the eurozone. And they seem to have forgotten the lessons of Greece, what a disaster that was, and how it was. And I just fear the same thing is going to happen again. And actually, the awful thing about it is that about 60% of, but well, I mean, I don't know the exact figures, but a large number of Bulgarians do not want this to happen, and yet it is going to happen regardless. And this is, the EU is baking in so much resentment in the local populations and this is what is leading to populism in Europe.
Well, I think the specifics of Bulgaria obviously is, they are very much on the front line of thinking, well, our near neighbour Russia, and therefore the mentality is, well, we've got to do all we can to link ourselves into Europe, and therefore, well, we've seen obviously with presidential elections in Poland only last week, how everything is on very much on a knife edge. But I do some work, and part of the work I do now with a European Family Office Fund means going to Lithuania, and you look at that nation, 2.9 million people. I mean, how the economic situation has been transformed in the 20 years they've been in the EU. They've
Mm.
got EU money, so that the transport network is fantastic. I mean, again, all people under the age of 40 in Lithuania now speak very good English. They're much more savvy, much more educated. That they've got some. I mean, not that their businesses, small and large, haven't got problems that they're concerned. Not least, obviously, with what's happening in Ukraine. But there is a sense of that they see themselves, and again, with a rising Russia, all those countries, even dare I say Hungary, with Viktor Orban in place, they have a number of concerns. They make life difficult for the European Commission. They push back, but there's no real appetite to leave the European Union.
Mm, yeah.
They see it as a binary choice. We're either linking up with Russia or we're going to be
But
in the
then on the
European
other
Union.
hand, it's a compare that they're you're comparing it to living under communism, which must have been flipping dreadful, and
Yeah.
any system has got to be better than that.
Yeah, but you have to remember is that there are, anyone of my age would have spent their whole childhood under communism. I was in my mid-20s by 1989, so
Yeah.
that's the mentality. The ruling class in those countries, that they take a different view, and if you're living in Poland and you're seeing more economic growth and greater GDP and everything else, you might think, well, having some decisions made out in Brussels is slightly dysfunctional, but it's a downside better than it was having decisions made in Moscow, which is what was happening between 1945 and 1989.
That is very true. So, what about here's turning the question on its head. Obviously, because Leave won the vote, even by quite a small margin, Leave is now accountable for what has happened. But imagine if Remain had won.
Yep.
Do you think that the EU would have seized upon this as a mandate for more and more and more ratcheting of power? And it is potential that the resentment and the fury and seething population might actually be a much bigger problem than the one we have at the moment, where we do have Keir Starmer's trying to reset our relationship with the EU, and we do have an opportunity to have a good relationship with them. And by the way, I don't necessarily agree with how he's going about it. He seems to be giving up all sorts of things and not getting very much in return. But, it might have been better the way things have played out rather than the alternative.
Yeah,
Do you have any
well,
thoughts
I
about
do
that?
have. I was deputy chairman of the Conservative Party at the time between 2015 and 2017. So during the year that led to Brexit, and then the period immediately afterwards, when everyone wondered what the hell was going on and how are we going to sort this all out. And I'll be honest, I did reflect on. Because I'll be honest again, my assumption was that we were going to vote Remain, and I thought it would be 55-45, something along the lines of the Scottish referendum of 2 years before, and I did start chatting with people both in Europe and in Tory colleagues, saying, well, listen, does this not mean if we do vote to Remain that they're going to be moving towards thinking about a single currency, thinking about, as you say, moving in a direction that potentially means we get more integrated. We've made up our mind, and this is the last time we're going to look at this for 30 or so years. Now, there may well have been all
Mm.
sorts of concerns
Don't you think
if we had
that's
moved in
the
that direction. I agree.
that would be the subject of a brilliant alternative history? Maybe we can hand the idea to Robert Harris or someone like that.
No,
I don't know
maybe
if
I ought
you've
to
read
become prime minister
Fatherland.
in 2021. Leading the charge towards it all as we were as we linked up with a whole group of other people. And what would have happened to Nigel Farage? Going back to the thing about where reform is, it is incredible situation, and that guy has been. When you think about as an influence, the influence that essentially led to the referendum
Oh no,
and stuff going
absolutely.
out.
He's been
But
a
how he's
one man
transformed things.
dynamo. But that's the problem. He's a one man dynamo and he doesn't seem to be able to lead a team. You do need a certain amount of unity to run a party. Well, I
True,
don't
true.
need to
Mind
tell
you, the
you.
same was said between about 1922 and about 1939 about Winston Churchill. And
Oh, really?
well,
Oh, yeah.
it's interesting, isn't it? It's the circumstances make for interesting sets of politics. But I think the concern that we have is that. The irony is the moment we've left the EU, we're having a political system that is now much more similar to Europe. It looks like we're going to get 4 or 5 parties, all with substantial blocks of votes. We may be in a situation at the next election where no party gets 30% of the vote. And, I think a question mark then is our voting system fit for purpose? Are too many
Wow, that's a good
people,
question.
so I think that's all quite a live debate in the constitutional issues that impact on the country in the years to come. And when I say the country, the other thing, of course, I touch on in my first chapter of my book, something that was close to my heart as I was growing up, the constitutional situation. The issue about Northern Ireland and Scotland. Again, both in the aftermath of Brexit, I think the question mark as to whether the United Kingdom, as we have understood it. And we've got to remember, we think of it as, Britain rules the waves, has been here forever. Well, we weren't united with Scotland before 1707. We weren't united, Northern Ireland has only existed since 1921, with the splitting up there. So these things have not been as set in stone historically as we would have us believe. But who knows? We could be in a situation that by 2050, 2060, that we have there is a United Kingdom of England and Wales, but Scotland and Northern Ireland have gone their own way, or Northern Ireland probably, United Ireland.
Well, the thing is, it's like if the Scots really want to go their own way, they should be able to do it, But if they took a hard-headed look at their own situation, I believe, and again, I haven't done any research on this, but of a population of about 5 million. Only 250,000 of them are net taxpayers.
Yeah.
And, without the Barnett formula, it's going to be really difficult for them to go it alone. And I don't say it's impossible. It would be possible, but they would have to lurch significantly to the right. And that is just not the Scottish way. I think the Scots are canny enough to recognise that.
They'll keep playing the grievance against it and make sure the Barnett formula goes from strength to strength. You may be right. The only thing I would say is, again, dare I say it?
But there's no real appetite for disbanding the Barnett formula, is there?
No. Again, once it's been set in stone. Well, not yet. Again, the red wall seats in the north of England, which the key, very volatile seats that were Labour for decades until 2019, and Boris Johnson won them on the Brexit election, back in the Labour category today, but may well become reform seats in 28, 29. They're the sort of areas, if you're in Newcastle or whatever, where they look a few miles further north and into Scotland. I think, well, actually, all the money that they're getting compared to what we're not getting for transport.
Oh, it must be infuriating.
I think that's where a lot of the tensions will come in. Of course, these are the key seats that any party aspiring to government in Westminster needs to be aware of. So a lot of that grievance could start up again. And the only thing I would say about you're right. It doesn't make economic sense for Scotland to leave, but it didn't make economic sense for us to leave the European Union either.
I don't know about that. It's not the disaster that it could. There are a lot of things like fintech, like life sciences, and you're quite right that it has come at a real cost. But on the other hand, it is, it's maybe a chance for Britain to reflect on its own role. And even though Brexit was really messy, it was painful, and it's caused an awful lot of division. Maybe it is, for example, I am very glad not to be in the EU now that they're letting in Bulgaria. It's like, by the way, I've got a very good Bulgarian friend, and I've been there on holiday skiing a couple of times. I love the country. I love Bulgaria. I just think, the EU is constantly thinking about the political project, and it doesn't really care about the people that actually have to live through their decisions.
Yeah, there's certainly a sense that the European Commission, it's constantly in a sort of frenetic activity, and that means it's like a conglomerate. We've got to get bigger. We've got to get more members. Whether that's the single currency. Bulgaria, of course, has been in the EU since 2008, along with Romania. But there is all the talk of Montenegro and Serbia and other countries joining at some point, and there's a sense that it needs to constantly get.
Sorry,
bigger.
I should have been clear. Joining the Eurozone,
well, the Euro rather than the EU. Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
But it's I don't think there's going to be any appetite to rejoin. Not least for two reasons. One, from our perspective, we would go in on a far worse terms than we left. Clearly, we would have, I think, if we were ever going to rejoin, we would have to be making clear there was a path joining the single currency, and what that path was we wouldn't be getting a rebate, so we'd be financially a lot worse off. We wouldn't be getting all the benefits of Schengen. We'd have to go in on the full package. And the other thing is, why would the EU want us back in? I mean,
Oh, they'd love to have us back.
no, no,
Come
no, no,
on.
no, not at the
Of course
moment.
they'd want us back.
I think the Commission would say, listen, until you get your house in order, and from their perspective, till the entire political class comes back and says, for cap in hand, we want to come back in, and we're nowhere near that.
They'll take Bulgaria, they'll take Greece, they'll take any economic basket case. Don't say they won't take us back. They would love to take us back because it would be it would be a feather in the cap of Ursula von der Leyen that and they'd be singing
Well,
Beethoven.
we won't go back in unless there's another referendum. And do you think, I mean, much as people may not think that Brexit has been handled very well, do you really think that at a referendum tomorrow we would vote to go back in?
That's a very good question. I don't know is the answer. And but for all the reasons that you articulated, because we'd have to go back in on a much worse deal,
Yeah.
I think,
And I think that would make it very a difficult sell for any government.
But don't you think that there's a real worry that Keir Starmer is getting us back in through the back door?
I really don't think so. I'm sorry.
You don't think so?
Listen,
Okay.
listen, if I were in Kemi Badenoch's shoes, of course, that's probably what I would have to. I'd have to say that it's all a
Yeah, but that's
betrayal.
politicking. I'm really not interested in
Yeah,
the
but I
posturing
don't
or the
think.
politicking.
Listen, I think
It's
what he's trying to, just and there's always the quid pro quo. I mean, fishing is a tiny industry, and listen, I'm not the MP for Grimsby, and I'm sure if I were, I'd be taking a different view on it. But it is a tiny industry, and therefore, looking at fishing rights, not least because they're so difficult to police, we're willing to give a little bit. I think that to try and do something for youngsters, because I think that is one of the worst things that we took for granted. We could go, go traveling, go interrailing or whatever into Europe, doing something to make life easier for people under the age of 30 to travel and within
oh
Europe,
no,
or for
I'm all
Europeans to
for
come
that.
to the UK. I think that makes perfect
Yeah.
sense. And so
And
having something.
actually, even though the EU will, as a whole, will obviously benefit far more than we will because there's so many young people in Europe who don't have jobs and could actually earn more money here. But I think it's really important to have young people working, as you say, and obviously the opportunity for our lot to go to Europe, even though vanishingly few of them
Yeah,
take the opportunity to work in Europe because of language difficulties and other
yeah.
things. But hopefully that will change. I mean, if we can actually improve language
But
capability,
everyone
I
speaks
mean,
English now, so that's going to take care of itself quite quickly, I think, to be honest.
yeah, maybe, but yeah.
But and the other thing, looking at these things like e-gates, and although we were very funny. A couple of years ago, we were just before Christmas. We went out to the Canary Islands, and we arrived, and there was this massive queue. There were no queues at all. There were no flights from Germany or anywhere else in Europe, and there's this massive queue at the non-EU gates, and it's fantastic. The pragmatism of the Spanish. Oh, come on, you Brits, just come on through our
Well, yes,
e-gates.
exactly.
That was great. Yeah,
Exactly. There is and there's an easing of that as well.
yeah.
It used to be really bad, like, and there was an element of punishment as well. And sometimes it was almost like, right, you voted for Brexit, you sit in that queue.
Can't blame them. We don't want to be part of the club. There are club rules here, and
But
you
and
put two
I'm
fingers up to the
delighted that
club, so
yeah,
you
no,
make it difficult for you.
absolutely. But I am really glad that we did not follow suit. I'm very glad that when EU people come to
Yeah.
Heathrow, they go in the same way they always have done, because I don't ever think that childish retaliation is a good idea. I have to say that 'cause in case one day my daughter listens to this. So
Well, they aren't coming in the boats either. They don't need to do that. They can come through the much more direct route. Yes.
that's very true. Yeah. But okay, so moving forwards on more positive things, or if there are any more positive things, um, we are where we are, and in fact, we can't change the position we're in now. But what do you think we should do moving forward as a country?
Well, I think part of the issue is that the political class has not been straight with the country about how serious the situation is. There's been the sense we can tinker here, tinker there, and as you say, whether it's to do with major issues like pensions, growth and productivity are, we know they're key, but I mean, fortunately, too few people in leading government roles have actually had much business experience to understand. And as you say, one of the biggest own goals was the saying, well, employers' national insurance goes up. Well,
Oh,
what better way to clobber the SME sector, which, as you say, is so crucial to that economic growth. So I think we need to think through some policies that are both, that are going to get growth going, but also, once we've got that going, to think. So there's some short-term policy stuff, and then how do we keep this engine moving along? And elements of that are, I see it obviously in the financial services market, elements of deregulation. I mean, unraveling some of what we've put into place in recent times, but not to such an extent to allow such risky behaviour to take place as it did in the past. But we need to.
yes, actually, I'm glad you brought that up. You mentioned several times in your book about the mispricing of risk.
Yeah.
What you mean is the failure to understand the actual political or financial risks in a model or a system.
Yeah,
Which I don't know
and
if
very
you've.
low interest rates have also done that.
Yes,
People have taken on unsustainable amounts of debt, which, well, they are sustainable for a period of time because with very low interest rates, there's little incentive for banks or others to pull the plug on failing businesses, and that actually is also very anti-growth because you've got. The nether regions of business are clogged up with unviable businesses rather than growing and successful businesses.
exactly. And also, when there's a big financial shock, the government steps in to insulate or cushion the blow, or do quantitative easing, or they take other measures rather than allow the system to absorb the shock and improve as a result of it. Even though that might be very short term, it might involve a lot of short term pain. And I don't know if you've ever read any books by Nassim Taleb. He wrote this amazing book, The Black Swan,
That's why I did read that.
about how we think black swan events are actually really rare, but they happen way more frequently than. So black swan event being a huge shock, which is unforeseen, and then being natural storytellers, we then create a narrative after the fact about why it happened, and actually there are so many black swan events. In fact, I wrote a list of them down. There's starting from Tony Blair's day, the Asian financial crisis, then the Russian debt default and the LTCM crisis, the dot-com bubble.
Yeah.
And then we had 9/11, which obviously was a huge, not only financial shock, but a massive attack at the very heart of Western democracy itself. The Enron scandal, I could go on and on and on, leading up to.
I agree.
A quick interjection here. A black swan event is one, as defined by Nassim Taleb, is one that is unpredictable, that has an extreme impact, and that is rationalized after the fact as if it were predictable, so that we think that we've learnt lessons from these events and we think we're prepared for the next time they occur. So after the Enron crisis, we had March 2003, the Iraq War and multiple intelligence failures, followed by 2004, the Indian Ocean tsunami, killing 230,000 people with no warning system. September 2008 was the global financial crisis. Lehman Brothers collapse triggers a global recession. Then we had the Greek sovereign debt default, which was related to that, which sent shockwaves through the Eurozone. May 2010 was a flash crash. The US stock market plunged another 9%. December 2010, the Arab Spring, which resulted in uprisings in the Middle East and North Africa. 2011 was the Fukushima nuclear disaster, sparked off by a tsunami. Then UK riots in 2011, widespread civil unrest following the shooting of Mark Duggan. 2015, the European migrant crisis, kicked off by the war in Syria. 2016, the Brexit referendum result, followed by the election of Donald Trump. 2018, the Facebook Cambridge Analytica scandal, which had massive implications for democracy. 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic, bringing global economies to a halt and resulting in the deaths of millions. 2021, the US Capitol riots by Trump supporters, and also the blockage of the Suez Canal, resulting in a global supply chain crisis. February 2022, the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. 2022 also saw the explosion of generative AI. March 2023 saw the Silicon Valley Bank collapse. October 2023 saw the Hamas attacks on Israel, the taking of hundreds of hostages, leading to massive regional conflict. 2024 saw an escalation of this conflict, expanded by the involvement of Hezbollah and rising tensions with Iran. Also in 2024, the Red Sea shipping crisis by Houthi-led attacks on commercial vehicles. Then regional bank instability in the US in 2024. And there are constant black swan events. And we always think that we've learned lessons from these things, but then the next time they happen, yet again, we're completely unprepared. Obviously COVID being a really good example where, the global supply chains just completely failed. Doesn't it make the case for, certainly in the UK, for decentralization and allowing for experimentation in different regions so that as a whole we're actually much stronger and able to survive these things?
Well, dare I say that's a whole new argument because we have become a very centralized state. Everything goes towards Westminster. And in fairness, political parties have tried to experiment with mayors, and we have metro mayors. But the reality is, until those metro mayors have significant tax raising powers and authorities, ultimately they're still dependent upon streams of money
Yes.
coming through from the centre, and then that's the problem. And also, they want a grandstand away, as some do to a varying degree. That it's always they're eager to
Are you
point
thinking
fingers
of
away.
anyone in particular?
Someone close to my heart, the mayor,
Okay.
the bloody mayor of London here in London. It's funny. I'm always amazed. It's a funny thing in politics. I'm amazed by the vitriol that some people have towards Sadiq Khan, who I knew quite well because we were MPs together. He was an MP, of
Oh,
course.
I'm sure he's
He's
delightful, and I'm
very,
sure he's
very nice
really.
guy. He's very softly spoken, very
I'm
reasonable
sure
guy personally. But the
I would love
vitriol
to
that people
sit
have for
next
the
to him at
guy, yeah.
dinner, but I hate what he's done to,
Yeah.
to the parking, to the, I don't know.
Well, it's
I
20 mile
really,
an hour and these bloody cycle lanes. I
yeah.
mean, it's insane. I mean, it is literally, it is slower today to get around central London in a car than it is by a horse and cart in the 1890s, because, you've got these constantly, these traffic lights, and you dare go above 20 miles an hour, and the cameras are flashing away morning, noon, and night. I mean, it's insane.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe I'm a bit burnt because I recently had to pay a massive fine because I forgot to pay the ULEZ on my old RAV4, which has now gone to the great Knackers yard in the sky. But I forgot to pay it, and I had a huge
Oh
fine as a
no, I'm
result
sorry,
of
Nick.
it. So mea culpa.
Well, we don't really need a car in London. We live in central London. There's pretty good transport, but we've got a sort of a 21-year-old Toyota Prius, which everyone assumes must be our sort of our second car. It's not around, so we don't disabuse them of that fact that it's actually our only car. It's alive and kicking, but obviously it gets all the it ticks all the boxes because we actually live within the centralized zone, but also the ULEZ. It's very good hybrid car and all that sort of stuff. But I mean, I'm afraid I've never had any great interest in cars, because whenever men start talking about high performance cars, I'm afraid this thing goes straight over my
Well, you
head.
switch off. Yeah, I've got to say, it gets me from A to B. I've now got a little Ford Fiesta, and that's
Good for you.
So, and it's only 20 quid a year to tax, and it's ULEZ compliant. So,
Perfect.
so I'm very conscious I've kept you on the
No, I'm very
podcast for a
glad.
really long time.
There's going to be lots of editing going on. I mean, gosh, I think what are we, about an hour and a half into this. It's perfect.
An hour and a half, yes, exactly. Productivity. We've now got a real mental health crisis going on. And one of the things that if you have a mental health issue, then one of the best ways of overcoming it is to go to work, to have social contact, to have routine. And yet successive governments have made it easier and easier for people with mental health issues to stay at home. And it might seem very comforting to stay at home if you have a mental health issue. And actually, you mentioned that your father was quite depressed.
Yeah.
You said he basically lived for a long time under a cloud of cigarette smoke and depression, which is a
Yeah.
really sad image.
Yeah.
But I just wonder, having that experience, what can we do to get people back to work?
It is difficult, and funny enough, I've got a portfolio existence. I kind of I work from home. Do go to board meetings and everything else. And I have my wife says to me, you're always so much more cheerful when you've been out and about and had meetings, and you go out and see friends and have a sort of social world. And of course, when I was in Parliament, that in a way it was kind of full on the grey area between personal life and political life. Men going out most evenings, and there would be a lot of socialising, and that
Yeah.
it did come to a bit of a jolt. I mean, partly because it coincided with COVID, so it came to a jolt. And I agree. I mean, I think that getting back to work, and particularly for young people, and I mean, listen, I'm not in any way belittling the mental health issues. I was very glad. I mean, we were very lucky. Our children were quite a bit younger when COVID hit. But for people who were in their mid to late teens and those teenage years, plus the early university years that were sort of wiped out essentially for during the whole COVID period, must have had a massive impact on a lot of people. And as you say, it doesn't really do them any favors to be in a job where they say, well, you can work from home 3 or 4 days a week. Actually, they need to be in the office. I mean, apart from anything else, you learn more by osmosis about being in the office with
Yes.
others. But also, it is a social life, and it's a let's have a quick, we'll go grab a sandwich at
It
lunchtime and
gives
have a
you an
quick drink
opportunity
after
to
work. Yeah.
observe how things are done, even if you don't, when you're in an office, you can actually watch people and observe an awful lot.
Yeah.
And you do absorb a huge amount.
So yeah, it isn't healthy, and I think we've got into this mindset, and again, the cost of commuting is heavy. So people, there is some people find it attractive, the idea. Well, I can work from home 2 or 3 days a week or whatever. But I'm not sure that it isn't having a major impact on mental health. And I think particularly young people in their 20s, and I can see that they have to weigh up the costs of 5 days a week going into the office. But
Mm.
the downside is that they're not getting either the experience or the interaction that, as you say, that is an integral part of living, really. And you don't live to work, but actually, work is an important part of your existence.
And there's so much loneliness amongst young people now. I think social media has made it much worse because, you have the illusion of interaction but you're not actually having face to face. We're very social creatures, and when we're face to face, we're swapping hormones, and whereas we don't even realize it. Kids seem to live a very atomized existence,
Yeah.
and loneliness is also really endemic amongst old people as well. And I think there's we've really got to try and these are the things we should be fixing,
Yeah,
rather
no,
than worrying
these
about our
are
global standing
big
in the world.
issues.
And
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean,
so,
about kind of I touch on it in the book, and it's slightly evocative. And people have read it about what life was like growing up in the 1970s. And of course, I've written it partly for my children's sake, because it's a very different world that we were living in. But one of the things I reflect on is how boring Sundays were. I mean, I came from a classic middle class background where it's a special day, and although my parents weren't particularly religious at all, we didn't go to church or anything. But it's a special day, and my brother and I were told we can't go out to see friends, and you just the shops weren't open. There was no sport on TV. Obviously didn't have all the
bored out of your gourd.
social
Yeah.
media. I mean, youngsters can't get bored these days. They've got so many. We know that the opposite problem is there. That that you've got this sort of a minuscule attention attention to detail, and you're constantly on some device or another. And I don't want to be glib about it. That also leads to the problems that you've alluded to, which is, the assumption is everyone else is having a fantastic time when they're not necessarily, but, and that the loneliness that comes with just looking at life through a screen. But it's a totally different world, the one that we grew up in. It really is. And it probably means, dare I say, our generation are perhaps less aware of just how serious those issues of atomization are for youngsters
Yeah,
growing up.
exactly. Um, I mean, there are so many other things we could
Well, we'll do
discuss, but
another one of these then.
Yes, I know. It's been an hour and 35. I think that's probably enough.
I think with the 95 minutes worth of stuff, that presumably was going to get cut a little bit in any event. So yeah.
Well, we might have to cut a little bit. Yeah,
Well, thank you so
exactly.
much
But
for the, and thank you for reading the book. I think you know it better than I do, for heaven's sakes.
no, no, we can't promise a huge following on the Indie Book Club yet,
yeah.
but we can promise that we will read your book very, very carefully.
I enjoyed writing it, and I think it hopefully tells also the story of, in a self-deprecating but realistic a way about some of the challenges you're under in politics as well as my life and
I
times.
think you got the balance between the memoir bit without being too personal, and also, the politics. And, I do think you were very fair to everyone except the EU. I think you gave them a bit of a free ride. But generally speaking, I think I can forgive you for that on the whole. It was a very entertaining book. And also, it was really interesting reading it. Half the things you alluded to, I was like, oh, yeah, I remember that. And otherwise, you would forget about it.
No, well, that's the other thing. Of course, when you're in the eye of the storm, you assume that everyone will remember forevermore that that you were involved in whatever it might have been. Wasn't that?
Yeah.
As I say, I kind of know what the first line in my obituary is going to be, but that's but for events of 20
Yeah,
or so
well,
years
oh
ago.
yes, that's well. The thing is, I
You
didn't want
haven't
to
been
ask you
touched on
about
that, so I'm
that.
very pleased to see.
Another quick interjection here. When Mark says he knows what the first line of his obituary will read, he's referring to his very well publicized affair with Liz Truss sometime around 2004, but it didn't come to light until after the affair was over, when Liz Truss put herself forward for the Chislehurst and Bromley by-election following the death of Eric Forth, and someone tipped off the Daily Mail to scupper her chances of winning. That's politics for you. But the only thing I did want to ask about that, is I'm guessing that whole Westminster atmosphere, the febrile politicking, and the cloak and dagger stuff, it must really lend itself to close relationships.
I've reflected on this as well. I think that what one has to remember is that most people go into politics, and when you think about it, you throw yourself to the mercy of the voters every 4 years. You're by nature risk takers, and of course, if you think about politics as well, you spend your time with having a lot of superficial relationship, meeting lots and lots of people. You've got, and by nature, most people in politics are fairly outward going, etc., etc. It almost, you're ticking most of the boxes for the people who are likely to, stray in whatever way that they may.
Yes,
so,
no, and also, if you're even outside of politics, if you're going to stray, it's more likely to be with someone from work.
Yeah.
Because you have a common purpose. You have, you're often working on, to deadlines, and it's very exciting. Do you know what I mean? So it really makes an awful lot of sense to me. But just for the record, you brought that up. I did not. So.
I didn't want the whole conversation from minute one to be, tell me a bit more about Elizabeth Truss. Oh God, here we go.
This is not Mum's Net.
Well, listen, really look forward to seeing you in a few weeks' time, and thank you so much. It's been great. Really enjoyed it.
Yeah, it has been really great. I'm sure we've forgotten to talk about something majorly important,
well, if you need to do something else that we can do, and I'll make sure I put the right shirt back on, and we can do it all again.
I'm sure we'll be fine. But thank you so much.
Super.
And I will chat to you soon. Actually, I'm looking forward to reading your other books as well. I haven't done that.
Oh, very good. Yes, yeah. There were sort of more collections of essays about more economics and geopolitics, but actually they're quite good sort of timepieces of that particular period in the last decade.
Well, it is an area I'm really interested in, especially the intersection between politics and finance, because I worked in the city.
Yes, you did. Yes,
years,
yeah. Well, I'm really looking forward to catching up and talking about that when we meet up.
Great.
Okay, have a great rest of the weekend. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
Bye-bye.
Cheers. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Indie Book Club. I'm your host, Cathy Evans from Inkspot Publishing, who sponsor all these podcasts. To all cooks, dog walkers, and drivers out there, we'd love to see you next time. Bye.